The time has arrived for Australia to abolish the Crown in the Constitution. This will forever cede the sovereignty of Britain over Australian affairs. Although British sovereignty in Australia has already been significantly attenuated through federal legislation, there is cause to act further. It has been almost 40 years since the Australia Act removed British parliamentary control over Australian affairs. Yet that federal legislation has not effectively established Australian sovereignty, nor has that legislation inspired self-determination. Such characterizations of effective statehood may only be achieved through substantial constitutional reform. To that end, the act of abolishing the Crown in the Constitution alone is not enough to secure Australian independence. Australia must make provisions in a coming referendum for an elected head of state to structure effective self-government in the civic interest. These aspirations are not radical notions of legal reform. In fact, they are consistently achieved among democratic nations where enlightenment over monarchy has prevailed. Through republics, people have formed independence through their own social contracts, and this has been a consistent effort since the United Kingdom abolished slavery in the British Empire. That abolition marked the rise of self-determination and freedom among people who had been racially, culturally, and politically oppressed under British rule. Indeed, the end of slavery marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire. Similarly, and in the spirit of emancipation, it is not a radical notion for First Nations Australians to demand a voice to Parliament, especially in Century 21. Participation is the only way to guarantee self-determination in a parliamentary democracy. First Nations Australians have in fact worn the chains of empire and then of commerce. First Nations Australians were often enslaved in chains before Federation in a practice known as blackbirding. After Federation, First Nations Australians have had their wages controlled or outright stolen, which has now only just been recognised and slowly compensated in 2020. The only reason to retain the Crown in Australia's social contract is to serve the diplomatic interests of the United Kingdom over Australian sovereign assent. For as long as the Crown's arbitrary and anachronistic powers remain in the Constitution, there can be no legitimate Australian sovereignty for Australian people. This foreign imposition denies the ascendancy of Australians in their own nation. Only the provision of a directly elected head of state can guarantee Australian sovereignty and self-determination. It is clear that the Crown, as a substitute to a democratically elected head of state, denies Australian consent in the right of an Australian to govern on behalf of Australians. The Constitution as it stands does not establish Australian sovereignty with definitude. Even after decades of legislation and policy reform, Australia's constitutional dysfunction has implications for its legal and economic pursuits. The 2020s will remain a volatile and high-risk global environment due to a climate emergency alone. This climate emergency is as impactve to the market power of major economies as it is for the political uncertainty among coronavirus and other future pandemics. The rise of populism among democratic nations is also something which we have been too accommodating of, even with the patterns of recent world history determining a clear warning against indifference to such populism. There's been too much complacency in the Australian legal fraternity regarding the Commonwealth Constitution. There are, however, pioneers. The jurisprudential expertise of Western Australia's first High Court Justice, Robert French, paints for us a flawed social contract between Australians and their government. I argue that the complacency toward a flawed social contract is the root cause of Australia's nugatory international influence. French acknowledges that the core principles of any international legal or economic activities is the effectiveness of a nation's domestic affairs. Extending on this expertise, it is my criticism that the Crown continues to subjugate Australians as dependents of the United Kingdom and the Crown's diplomatic agenda abroad. As I have observed, this subjugation disaffects Australians from other nations. Some nations are disaffected by Australia's lack of visible sovereignty. Other nations through a perception that Australia will only ever serve UK interests. Former Australian Prime Minister John Howard has been brought into scrutiny for degrading Australian sovereignty abroad for these specific reasons. If Australia is a just nation, Australia must play a democratising and developing role in the Indo-Pacific region. Australia must stand independent from the Crown and all that it represents. Australians have no constitutionally enshrined representation of their interests in government, which demands political resolve. For Australia to be a serious contender in a global age, Australia's constitutional government must exhibit strength and stability among other nations. In economics and law, bargaining comes from a position of power. To be taken seriously in trade, an individual must have high stakes on offer to influence a desirable outcome. The same principle is true from an international perspective, for obvious reasons. The European Consortium for Political Research determines this principle, and I quote, "The bargaining power of a country declines when its companies make foreign direct investments in the partner country, as well as when its companies rely on inputs for their production from this partner country because they are integrated in global value chains. The more a country's companies are dependent on a partner country, the lower is the country's power to coerce concessions from this partner country," end quote. Australia must have a strong sovereign structure to develop itself as a wealthy and resourceful nation. Currently, Australia is not among the top nations rated by the International Monetary Fund based on gross domestic product. This fact demonstrates, at least to me, that Australia needs to evolve as a nation to develop its economic competition abroad. Simply put, to be noticed internationally, we as Australians must develop our nation to a standard that is acceptable among nations who are our natural allies. We as Australians can only justify trading with democracies where their broader citizenry value freedom. It is preferable to trade with nations that exhibit a higher standard of regulation in trade and industrial relations as well. Further, we as Australians must be able to inspire confidence among heads of governments in developing nations. These nations are best served through the rule of law and freedom through democratic means. On a more forensic level, to prove the principle of this point, you only need to look at industrial relations itself. If a workforce exhibits disunity and dispute, productivity is guaranteed to be compromised. Australia has unresolved disputes, and until these disputes are resolved, Australia will not command real power in the international community. It was never viable for the Australian government to discount First Nations Australians from the census from as early as Federation. That position has remained the consensus of the highest judicial powers in Australia since the 1990s, with the decision to reject the claims of terra nullius. First Nations people continue to bear the blame for this core injustice through the cultural deficit approach. Such an approach is endemic to poorly managed companies and native title trustee services, as well as government departments. The most direct and sure way to develop Australia as a nation of independent and sovereign people is through the constitutional reform at the Commonwealth level.